Good.
Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our Season of Creation webinar, Voting in Our Common Home, Reflections from the Catholic Tradition. Before we get started, we have an announcement about Spanish translation.
Bienvenidos todos, especialmente los que están participando que hablan español. Tenemos traducción simultánea en español durante este evento. Haga clic en el icono del mundo en la esquina derecha de la pantalla. Hay un icono que dice que parece un mundo. Apriete allí. Escoja Spanish, el que va a ser español, y allí va a empezar a oír a los intérpretes. Recuerden que no pueden escuchar la interpretación del idioma a través de su teléfono. Solo funciona la interpretación a través del audio de su computadora. Incluiremos la grabación de la interpretación en español en el correo electrónico que mandaremos en los próximos días. Si necesitan más ayuda, manden un mensaje en la caja que dice QA, no el chat, sino la caja que dice QA, que es las preguntas y respuestas. Gracias.
Thank you, Paz. Again, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Season of Creation webinar, Voting in Our Common Home, Reflections for the Catholic Tradition. I'm Kayla Jacobs, Youth Mobilization Program Manager and also Interim Policy Staff at Catholic Climate Covenant. Very happy to be here with all of you today. Before we get started, we do have some housekeeping information. This session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out to everyone who registered within the next 24 to 48 hours. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box. If you know who the question is directed to, please add that information to your question. With such a large group of people attending, we will probably not get to all of your questions, unfortunately. The chat on Zoom is available for you to chat with others attending the session. The chat should not be used to submit questions. We will likely not see your questions in the chat. Please remember to always be civil in your interactions on the chat. And now I would like to pass it over to Connor Murray, a member of our Young Adult Advisory Board and a student of Iona University, to lead us in prayer.
Hello, thank you, Kayla. My name is Connor Murray. I am a senior at Iona University, double majoring in criminal justice and political science, and a proud member of the Young Adult Advisory Board at Catholic Climate Covenant, as well as working in politics and elections. Today, I wanted to read a selection from Thomas Merton. Little background on Thomas Merton. I consider him sort of like a spiritual great-grandfather. He was a very popular sort of central figure in the Catholic ecology movement during the 20th century. He was a Trappist monk called to live a life of silent contemplation. But as he lived that life of silent contemplation, his words spoke to a lot of different people. He did a lot of writing, and it really spoke to people, including me. So I wanted to share one of his writings. So I will do that now. All Christian life is meant to be at the same time profoundly contemplative and rich in active work. It is true that we are called to create a better world, but we are first of all called to create a more immediate and exalted task, that of creating our own lives. In doing this, we act as co-workers with God. We take our place in the great work of mankind, since in effect the creation of our own destiny in God is impossible in pure isolation. Each one of us works out his own destiny in inseparable union with all those others with whom God has willed us to live. We share with one another the creative work of living in the world, and it is through our struggle with material reality, with nature, that we help one another create at the same time our own destiny and a new world for our descendants. May Thomas Merton's words remind us that we are the Lord's creation and he works within us always, and may we remember that we truly have the potential to create a better world, if only by allowing him to guide us towards love and communion through our words, our actions, and our choices. Thank you. Looking forward to this.
Thank you, Connor. Now I would like to introduce the webinar a little bit more to all of you. Voting is an important way for Catholics to live their faith, which, as Pope Francis said in Evangelii Gaudium, always involves a deep desire to change the world, to transmit values, to leave this earth somehow better than we found it. In this webinar, we will explore important themes in church teachings, consider how they might help us in our voting decisions, and reflect on how Catholics might form their consciences and appreciate church teaching that affirms the primacy of a well-formed conscience, recognize how values are interconnected and transcend and inform our approach to issues, better understand and engage the fullness of church teaching on voting, and help equip Catholics for conscientious, values-based voting discernment. And now I'm happy to introduce our two speakers today. Our first speaker is Bishop Joseph Tyson. He has been the bishop of the Diocese of Yakima in Washington since 2011 and serves as a member of the USCCB's Committee for Cultural Diversity and is chair of the USCCB's Pastoral Care for Migrants, Refugees, and Travelers. Bishop Tyson serves on Catholic Climate Covenant's board and is our Episcopal moderator. Dr. Dan Dileo is Associate Professor and Director of the Justice and Peace Studies program at Creighton University. His teaching, research, and scholarship focus on Catholic social teaching, public theology, and climate change. Since 2009, he has been a consultant with Catholic Climate Covenant. Dan earned a PhD in theological ethics with a minor in systematic theology from Boston College. Thank you both for being here, and Bishop Tyson, I could take it away.
Thank you, and it's just great to be with all of you today. I'm kind of teeing off, I think, for Professor Dileo a little bit, and what I'm just going to focus on for a few minutes to kind of create the pathway is just around Pope Francis and the connections a little bit between his three major writings on the topic of climate and social friendship. Laudato Si, Laudate Deum, I Fratelli Tutti. You know, those, of course, all of us are probably aware and have been motivated by Laudato Si, and we have a whole movement about that. So let me just start with that, and let me note this, and you know, as we move from Connor's comment, wonderful quote from Thomas Merton, not yet canonized, we're all thinking about that. The one thing I would want to emphasize about what ties these three writings of Francis together is the whole thing is a commentary. It's a whole thing is prayer. It's anchored in prayer. It's like a Lectio Divina. Laudato Si, and I'm just going to read one paragraph of the prayer. It's just a short prayer. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially Sir Brother's Son, who brings the day and gives you light through him. And he is beautiful and radiant in all his splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. In this, the very title, Laudato Si, is the repetitive refrain in St. Francis of Assisi's famous canticle, Laudato Si Signore, Laudato Si Signore, Laudato Si Signore. It's over and over again. And those of you who are grammarians know that this is kind of the subjunctive case. We don't have it much in English. It's praise be you. God is not just one more object of the world. Everything we do, everything we are, it comes from God, this groundedness of God. Fundamental to our reflection is being rooted and grounded in encountering God. God, the ground of all creation, of all humanity, of all relationship. Francis of Assisi, and this is the ring, Laudato Si. So when Francis, when you read Laudato Si, and many, you know this better than I do, Laudato Si at times has material in there for graduate level seminars on the science of climate change. But fundamentally, it's important to say, you see, in that core, at the core, this is a direct quote from Francis's prayer. And scholars tell us this canticle is the first prayer written in colloquial and Latin attributed to someone. So then when we get to Laudate Deum, that's also a direct quote from the prayer. Now, Laudate Deum, as many of you know, is an intensification of Laudato Si. When you read Laudato Deum, you get a sense of Francis, the urgency. He's concerned that the COPE process is not resulting in a reduction of average temperature. He's concerned that not enough progress has been done. Going back to the prayer of Francis, that urgency is in that prayer. The prayer ends with praise and bless my Lord. It's an imperative. Laudate Deum. We must praise God in how we create and how we treat creation and treat each other. Of course, both Laudate Si, Laudato Si and Laudate Deum emphasize our place as humans in this larger gifted creation and our common home. So, in other words, this is a triptych: Laudato Si, Laudate Deum, e Fratelli Tutti. As I kind of cue up a little bit, Professor Dileo, let me just, in terms of Fratelli Tutti, in many ways it draws out, particularly from Laudato Si, our treatment of people. Now, I'm going to summarize Fratelli Tutti in one word, and it's a Spanish word: descartados. And the reason I'm doing that is I was thinking back to our Ad Limina visit. Every 5 years, bishops from around the world have a scheduled meeting with the Holy Father, and they report in. Our for the United States was in 2019, right before COVID, the COVID shutdown. We were there in February, and by March, we were shut down here in the Northwest. As you know, COVID had its first toehold here in Washington State. And in our discussions with the Holy Father, we talked about the many variants of Catholic social teaching and the tension we sometimes have of folks that are passionate about social justice, folks who are passionate about the life issues, beginning of life issues, what's the linchpin that ties these things together? And when the Holy Father talked to us about, bringing together people in a social friendship and pulling together the tensions that we sometimes see even in parish life between the pro-life activists and the folks that are very much into social justice, he talked about the linchpin being a throwaway culture. In other words, when we talk about global pollution and plastic waste and what descartados in Spanish, it really kind of refers to the packaging. We just throw that away. And what Pope Francis was getting at, and you see this in Fratelli Tutti, is that that's also what we're doing to people. People become part of the packaging we throw away. The throwaway culture, throwaway pollution leads, we create a class of throwaway people, los descartados, the throwaway. That is kind of the front edge of the challenge of Laudato Si, Laudate Deum, y Fratelli Tutti, with its grand call to social friendship. Now, at the heart of Fratelli Tutti is this parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbor? Well, the person in need, to quote Ambrose. Who is my neighbor? I often in this context think about the interchange between San Juan Diego of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the third time where Juan Diego is trying to avoid the request of Our Lady to build a place of mercy and love. He doesn't really respond to the apparition of Our Lady in Tepeyac initially. The third time, when she's insistent that he goes to the bishop, the translation from the Nicomapoa, the Nahuatl, into Spanish is a ti, yo te he elegido a ti. Juan Diego is saying, I'm nothing. No soy nada más que una escalera de tabla. I'm so low. I'm like lowly walking planks that people walk on. You should choose somebody else to go to the bishop, someone más digno, someone more elevated of importance. And of course, Our Lady says to him, no, I could have chosen anyone. A ti, yo te he elegido a ti. God is deliberately choosing to teach us through the descartados of every age, and to view the beauty and the dignity of the human person. This is really at the heart of Tutti Fratelli, of Fratelli Tutti, this intense sense that we need to build social friendships, and that the just treatment of the environment, the just treatment of our common home, the earth, is intimately interconnected with a just treatment of each other. So it's a beautiful triptych that we've received from Pope Francis in his writings with Laudato Si, Laudate Deum, y Fratelli Tutti. Those are just a few little comments I wanted to make, and hopefully, Dan, I've kind of queued you up for, I know, a robust and great presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Bishop Tyson. Dan Dileo, Dr. Dan, feel free to take it away.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and especially to Bishop Tyson for being here and sharing his insights with us in terms of the social vision of Pope Francis. And I want to emphasize Francis's vision isn't unique. It extends more broadly into the Catholic tradition back hundreds and thousands of years. So Francis is echoing what's there in our tradition already. What I want to do today is build on what Bishop Tyson gave us with some specific reflections on the topic of voting discernment. What you can see here is a QR code and a short bit.ly link to a new resource that the Covenant has published to help people in the discernment process ahead of the elections. And so the QR code will be on all the screens moving forward, but wanted to flag that this is a resource available for you and to share with folks in your world. When we think about voting, we're talking about faith, at least in the Catholic tradition. And I think it's important to define terms that most basically faith is the adequate response to God's love. That's what we're talking about, responding to God in love. We love because God first loves us. When we think about the life of faith, as we heard, Pope Francis calls in Evangelii Gaudium for an authentic faith that always involves a deep desire to change the world and to transmit values. An adequate response to God's love is not individual religion or personal piety. This is a social ethic. And the key is to transmit values into society. And there are lots of different values, as the compendium of the social doctrine church describes. Essentially, these values are truth, freedom, justice, and love. When we think about these as the kind of cornerstones of Catholic values, we can focus on each, but as Francis describes in Laudato Si, we have to remember that it cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. And this idea of interconnectedness is going to cut through and across a lot of the material that we consider today. In terms of conscientious discernment, we have to appreciate the dignity, priority, and inviolability of the individual conscience. The Second Vatican Council in Gaudium et Spes describes conscience as the most secret core and sanctuary of a person. There one is alone with God, whose voice echoes in their depths. When we speak about conscience, what we're really talking about is the capacity to enact values, those values that Francis describes as essential to an authentic faith. And it's the capacity to enact those values by discerning both whom we want to be and what we want to do. So we're discerning what kind of person we want to be in terms of virtue, and we're discerning what kind of actions we want to take, specifically in this context, the action of voting. When we think about conscience, it's not static, it's dynamic. And it's dynamic, especially in the sense that conscience has to be formed. As the US bishops write in their document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, Catholics have a serious and lifelong obligation to form their consciences in accord with human reason and the teaching of the church. And those sources are important because neither one of them, and in fact, none of the sources that we consult have a monopoly on truth. In the Catholic tradition, we recognize 4 sources for conscience formation. And if you think about conscience here on this Venn diagram, it's kind of the center of these overlapping sources. As the bishops describe, we reference our experience and we use reason to discern what is moral truth in a particular circumstance. We call this the natural law. We also talk, though, about reason being informed by faith, in this case, faith expressed through both scripture and tradition. Tradition is the broader life of the community within which the magisterium has unique authority to teach. So the magisterium, as the Pope and other bishops, have a unique role to teach, but it's important to appreciate that not all magisterial teaching is monolithic. Not all official church teaching is dogmatic or infallible. In terms of ecclesiology, the study of the church, there are at least 3 different levels of church teaching. Most central to the tradition is what we call dogma. These are the infallible moral teachings that are owed the assent of faith. In the area of morals, we can think about universal moral imperatives like the command to love. This is at the absolute heart of the tradition. Very few teachings, relatively speaking, are dogmatic and infallible. Most magisterial teachings fall in the second category of doctrine. These are non-infallible norms, which are owed what we call obsequium religiosum, or religious docility of will and intellect. The idea here is that these teachings are normative for the church, but they're non-infallible. They admit to the possibility of error. And so Catholics are called to seriously consider them, to prayerfully reflect on them. But ultimately, in good conscience, a Catholic has the ability to conscientiously disagree with the doctrinal teaching. Even more peripheral in terms of magisterial teaching are what we call prudential judgments. Again, non-infallible applications of dogma and doctrine. And so we can think about this, especially in terms of public policy recommendations and applications. So magisterial teaching is nuanced, and that's important because in the catechism, we're reminded that a person must always obey the certain judgment of their conscience. Now, certain judgment presumes that a person has thoughtfully reflected on and prayerfully considered a teaching, but ultimately conscience has the final say, even with respect to magisterial teaching. And this is what Pope Benedict described writing as Archbishop Joseph Ratzinger. He writes that over the Pope, as the expression of the binding claim of ecclesiastical authority, there still stands one's own conscience, which must be obeyed before all else, if necessary, even against the requirement of ecclesiastical authority, especially when we think about the levels of teaching at doctrine and prudential judgment. A Catholic is called to consider them, to prayerfully reflect on them, but ultimately to follow the certain judgment of their conscience. And this is what Pope Francis describes more succinctly in Amoris Laetitia. We, meaning the magisterium, has been called to form consciences, not to replace them. So this is an important prerequisite to thinking about conscientious voting discernment. Conscience ultimately has the final say, and a person has a responsibility to form and follow their conscience. When we think about voting, we're talking about prudence. Prudence applies general values to particular circumstances, and so people make different judgments, and we have to recognize that reasonable minds may disagree. This is what St. Thomas Aquinas describes, that in matters of action, truth, or practical rectitude, it's not the same for all as to matters of detail, but only to general principles. In other words, we're called to recognize the core values, but we have to recognize also that people have different ways of understanding the most appropriate way to apply those values in different circumstances. When we think about conscience and voting, we first have to recognize what we actually do when we vote. We don't vote typically for an issue, we vote for a person, right? We fill in the bubble next to the name of an actual person. And so in the process of voting discernment, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops describes that these decisions should take into account, first of all, a candidate's commitments, character, integrity, and their ability to influence a given issue. We also have to consider candidates' integrity, philosophy, and performance. So before we think about issues, we have to think about the candidate and the degree to which they seem likely to promote or undermine core values in society. So we vote for candidates, not person, not issues. That's an important initial reflection. We also have to recognize that because everything is interconnected, values transcend issues, and no issue has a monopoly on a value. The U.S. bishops write that as Catholics, we're not single-issue voters. A candidate's position on a single issue is not sufficient to guarantee a voter's support. This is what Cardinal Bernardin described now 40 years ago in his consistent ethic of life, that the value of life cuts across the issues of capital punishment and abortion and war and all of the other social issues that we consider. More recently, Pope Francis in Gaudete et Exsultate described it this way: defense of the innocent unborn, for example, needs to be clear, firm, and passionate, for at stake is the dignity of a human life. So the core value is human dignity. This dignity is always sacred and demands love for each person, regardless of their developmental stage. Equally sacred, however, are the lives of the poor, those already born, the destitute, the abandoned, and underprivileged, the vulnerable, infirm, and elderly exposed to covert euthanasia, victims of human trafficking, new forms of slavery, and every form of rejection. So when we think about values, values cut across issues, and no issue has a monopoly on a value. This is what Bishop Stowe has described with respect to the environment. He writes that without the environment to sustain human life, you can't have human life. So the value of human life cuts across many issues, including the issue of the environment. Another important point is that no issue has infallible, that is to say, dogmatic preeminence. And I think this is an important point to recognize, given what the bishops have written in their introductory note to Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. As many people well know at this point, they've written that the threat of abortion remains our preeminent priority. This determination is a non-infallible prudential judgment in terms of the levels of church teaching. So this is owed by the faithful conscientious obedience. This is what the U.S. bishops describe in the Challenge of Peace as the expectation that Catholics give moral judgments serious consideration. They're forming their own views on specific problems. So Catholics are called to recognize the authoritative value of this particular teaching. At the same time, however, this is not an infallible and dogmatic teaching. This is what Cardinal McElroy describes in his reflections thinking about this issue of preeminence. He writes, there is no mandate in universal Catholic social teaching that gives a categorical priority to either of these issues. Here he's talking about both abortion and climate change as uniquely determinative of the common good. The death toll from abortion is more immediate, but the long-term death toll from unchecked climate change is larger and threatens the very future of humanity. So the values of dignity and life cut across both issues. Both abortion and the environment are core life issues in Catholic teaching. The designation of either of these issues as the preeminent question in Catholic social teaching at this time in the United States will inevitably be hijacked by partisan forces to propose that Catholics have an overriding duty to vote for candidates that espouse that position. Recent electoral history shows this to be a certainty. So when we think about this issue of preeminence, it's important to hear this in the context of the levels of church teaching and the corresponding responses that Catholics in conscience owe to those different teachings. Even if a person prudentially judges that one issue or another is preeminent, we also have to recognize that no solution has a monopoly on addressing an issue. We saw that reasonable minds can disagree. We see this in Laudato Si, where Francis writes that strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. So people can agree that an issue is important or maybe even preeminent, but people may disagree about the most appropriate, most effective strategy for addressing that issue. So no solution has a monopoly on addressing an issue. Another important point is that the term intrinsic evil is of limited help to voting discernment. This term intrinsic evil is increasingly used to identify issues as preeminent or as overridingly important. In Catholic moral theology, intrinsic evil has a very specific definition. An action is always wrong and can't ever be justified. That's what intrinsic evil means. Based on this definition, there are lots of intrinsic evils. For example, St. John Paul II, in Veritatis Splendor, describes intrinsic evils as whatever is hostile to life, so there's the value, such as any kind of homicide, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, whatever violates the integrity of the human person and is offensive to human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution and trafficking in women and children, degrading conditions of work which treat laborers as mere instruments of profit. All of these are intrinsic evils, all of them, based on the core definition. What this means is that to call something an intrinsic evil doesn't communicate the relative moral gravity of a particular issue. To call one issue an intrinsic evil is not to say that it's more important than another issue. Calling something an intrinsic evil also doesn't identify a solution. Again, reasonable minds may disagree about the best way to address some issue recognized as an intrinsic evil. And finally, calling something an intrinsic evil doesn't guide cooperation with evil, which is to say that this doesn't give direction on how to vote for a candidate who may in some way actually advance some intrinsic evil. This is what Pope Benedict XVI described in terms of cooperation with evil and voting discernment. Understanding this category in moral theology can expand conscientious voting potential. In Catholic moral theology, we identify two different kinds of cooperation with evil. If another person plans to do something wrong, there are two ways to think about this. The first is formal cooperation, where we intend to help advance the evil of another. This is always prohibited. Material cooperation does not intend to advance the evil of another. It's a kind of unintended consequence. This can be permitted in some circumstances, and this is what Pope Benedict XVI, writing as Cardinal Ratzinger, describes. When a Catholic does not share a candidate's stand in favor of abortion and or euthanasia, but votes for that candidate for other reasons, it's considered remote material cooperation, which can be permitted in the presence of proportionate reasons. In other words, a Catholic in good conscience could vote for a candidate who supports approaches to addressing issues that the church would otherwise disagree with. And here, when we think about cooperation, the reason is a value. A proportionate reason means that there may be values at stake across lots of other issues that on balance outweigh the prohibition on voting for an issue that is considered intrinsically evil, for example. So, for example, because issues are interconnected, one could argue, as Bishop Stowe does, that without the environment to sustain human life, you can't have human life, that an authentically pro-life vote is considering climate as a pro-life issue. Again, we saw from Cardinal McElroy, the death toll from abortion is more immediate, but the long-term death toll from unchecked climate change is larger and threatens the very future of humanity. So when we think about cooperating evil in the sense of an unintended consequence of voting for one candidate or another, the Catholic tradition has resources to expand the voting potential, and maybe people have been told or familiar with. Finally, when we think about church teaching on all these issues, we have to appreciate the depth of church teaching on climate change. This did not begin with Francis in 2015 with Laudato Si. This goes back more than 30 years to St. John Paul II, who in 1990 described the greenhouse effect as having reached crisis proportions as a consequence of industrial growth, massive urban concentrations, and vastly increased energy needs. Similarly, Pope Benedict XVI, across his papacy, repeatedly addressed climate change, asking, for example, in 2010, can we remain indifferent before the problems associated with such realities as climate change? Here in the United States, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has repeatedly identified climate change as a moral issue, going back to 2001, for example, in their document, Global Climate Change, a plea for dialogue, prudence, and the common good. And again, Pope Francis, as we heard at the beginning in both Laudato Si and Laudate Deum, describing climate change as one of the principal challenges facing society and the community. So when we think about voting discernment from a Catholic perspective, there are a lot of different things to consider. We have to consider candidates in terms of their character, integrity, and ability to influence an issue. We have to consider candidates' integrity, philosophy, and performance. We have to recognize that values transcend issues, that no issue has a monopoly on a value. We have to recognize that no issue has infallible, that is to say, dogmatic preeminence, and no solution has a monopoly on addressing an issue. We also have to recognize that intrinsic evil is of limited help to voting discernment. In my experience, this term has been used as a kind of rhetorical sledgehammer to prioritize different issues. In the technical sense, this issue is of very limited help to voting discernment. We also have to appreciate the church's teaching on cooperation with evil and recognize the possibility of remote cooperation with candidates who support things that a person might not otherwise agree with. And finally, we have to recognize the depth and consistency of church teaching on climate change and as an issue that implicates so many of those values that we're called to advance as persons of faith. So hopefully this gives an enriched sense of the Catholic tradition and the resources that are available to persons of faith as they go through the process of discerning who to vote for. And as Kayla said at the beginning, we appreciate your time and attention and look forward to conversation.
Thank you, Bishop Tyson, and thank you, Dr. Dan Dileo. A lot of information, a lot of things for all of us to discern and think about. So yeah, we will move now into the Q&A portion. Remember to put your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat. So let's get started. I think, Dan, this is probably more directed to you, but somebody asked, can you go deeper with your comment on we don't vote for an issue, we vote for candidates? Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Sure. I think practically when we step into the voting booth, we're holding the ballot in front of us, unless it's a ballot initiative where we're actually voting on a specific issue. What we functionally do is we vote for candidates. We fill in the circle next to the name of an actual person. So before we begin to think about issues and stances on issues, we need, as the bishops described, we need to think about that person that candidate as a person. What are their core values? What seem to be their character? And give consideration to the candidate as a person, not just think about the related issues.
Thank you.
And I'll say, in my experience, that's often a neglected feature of voting discernment. We often tend to jump to issues, and even more specifically to recommended solutions to issues, and we kind of overlook the fact that when we vote for people.
Thank you. Also, somebody asked, as Catholic organizations or people who might work for nonprofits, Catholic nonprofits, in terms of not being partisan, is it okay for Catholics to say, like, vote for climate? That's what the question is, and how do we navigate that?
Well, Dan, Professor Dileo might have more thoughts on that. I think there were two pieces in that when I was looking in the chat. One is regarding distribution of literature in churches. And so we only distribute things in our parishes for the discernment of our parishioners that are cleared through either our state conference or our Catholic conference, because those are vetted for partisanship. So that's the first piece. And second, and this is playing off a little bit of what Professor Dileo had mentioned, the nuncio had a very good comment. He said, polarization occurs when we focus on issues rather than people. This is where, when you're voting for a candidate, there's a lot going on with that candidate. And when you know one candidate, you know one candidate. And they're a bundle of opinions around solutions they might be proposing to their platform to public policy questions. And some of those might align quite nicely to Catholic social teaching, others not so much. And so that's where I really appreciated what Dan had mentioned, that you don't want to just jump to the issue and jump to the solution. You're voting for a concrete candidate. And in fact, what Archbishop Christophe Pierre was suggesting in one of his comments is that we get into a polarized situation when we focus on issues rather than people, including people running for public office. Hope that helps.
Bishop Tyson. There's a question here. Any strategies for addressing misinformation and clarifying candidate stances on climate change, but really any issue? Like, how can we navigate conversation when there's so much misinformation out there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Bishop. I don't know if you have pastoral ideas about this. I mean, in my own life, I think part of what this entails is Francis's idea of a culture of encounter and authentic dialogue. And so, at my parish, for example, we've got a Catholic social teaching formation group that's having essentially kind of listening sessions, talking about what are people interested in, but also what does the church have to say about these issues. I know some folks use the bulletin as ways of catechesis and formation to just share, what does the church say about this issue? What does the church say about this issue? So I think to the degree that people can use, especially some of those parish channels and pathways to communicate church teaching and to provide resources that link to the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, for example, I think those are concrete strategies for communicating what is often not understood or not well articulated about the Catholic tradition.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan. I would have flipped two things. The first thing is this, there is lots of misinformation, and I don't know that I think we're all, I'm kind of more of an analog guy. I listen to AM radio and FM radio. I'm not on Spotify or any of that. So I am not on cable. I have rabbit ears on my TV set. So I'm just a little more, not into everything going on in cable world. But it is good to read broadly, And so I guess my one word answer is curiosity. So when we get into polarization, can we be curious about the other? When you mentioned the word encounter, I mean, in Spanish, this is again, I mentioned descartados. Another key word for Francis is encuentro. And encuentro is not, it's a strong word. It isn't just an encounter with casually. It's kind of being with people who think differently from you and look differently from you and having a curiosity. I try, Alan Westman has just written a very interesting book called The Role of the Church in an Age of Polarization. So that's kind of ringing in my head. But the key word there is curiosity. Can we be curious about how someone else came to believe and think their opinion? Can we be curious about that? And that's the encuentro. Actually being with somebody who is not who's not on the same page as you. And I think that might be a missing art. And I just saw Ann Zimmer, thank you. Curiosity is key and requires real listening. Absolutely, Ann. Thanks for that comment in the chat. So anyway, back to whoever wants to talk next here.
Thank you, Bishop Tyson. I am seeing a lot of questions about a recording and the slides and citations. So yes, we are recording and we will send the recording out, and we also will send the slides. And Dan provided a lot of citations from church documents in the slides themselves, but in the one pager that he also shared, there is a whole list of citations on page 2 of that one pager, so it's 2-pager, that could lead you to where we're pulling that information from. So just wanted to get that out there. One question that we had is it appropriate to encourage the church to have a much more visible role within political discourse?
Yeah, I'll take that because it bears on the mission of the church. And this is a slide that I cut for the sake of time. But when we think about the role of the church is people of God called to love. As Francis describes in Laudato Si, love affects not only individual relationships, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. And when we think about politics in the very basic sense from the Greek politica, we're talking about activities that structure and organize a community. Because of this, as two theologians, Ken and Michael Himes, describe, politics matter because people matter. politics matter because, for better or for worse, how we structure life in community either promotes the dignity of persons or it violates and undermines the dignity of persons, especially the poor and vulnerable. So this is why the U.S. bishops describe in forming consciences that participation in political life is a moral obligation. At the same time, the church is involved in the political process, but isn't partisan. And I think this is unfortunately where there tends to be a conflation of terms. To be political is not to be partisan. Partisan is to be blind with one candidate or party in the political process. Now, the church can't champion a candidate or a party, but the church as an organization, both as the full people of God, but also as the institution and the magisterium, are called to be part of the political process, because this is one of the ways that we love. So in terms of participation, it's a kind of a delicate balancing to be political but not partisan. But in terms of the church's mission, as the bishops describe, participation in political life is a moral obligation, individuals and for the church collectively.
I'm wondering if I can go there a little bit too. And Dan, thank you. I think that you're making excellent points. You know, let me say this, and it might be a little bit tangential. If we have not dialogued with the Word of God, if we have not, prayed to God, if we're not in a direct conversation with God, listening first, it's very hard to have a change of heart and a change of mind. That's where maybe I'm hitting this back to the earlier presentation. Pope Francis, and dare I say, Saint Francis, are very clear that this begins with our relationship with God, listening to God. If we are not dialoguing with the Word of God in Scripture, it's going to be very hard to dialogue on this type of value-based conversation where we're listening to others. All of this needs to be grounded in the spiritual life. Without that base, we run the risk of being clangy gongs on our pet issues. So it's a bit tangential, but I think it's crucial to remember that the dialogue begins with God.
Definitely. Thank you, Bishop Tyson. That kind of leads to another question. Obviously, dialogue begins with God. This question is about dialogue with others. And the question is, are there limits to dialogue? To go a little deeper, that, there are people who want other people to suffer or aren't being welcoming to vulnerable people, and how do we have dialogue with those people but also make sure that the church is a place that's safe, that protects vulnerable populations and has a space for them to feel comfortable as well.
Well, that's a good question, and Dan, you might want to go here as well. I've got a little informal rule in the post-COVID world. I mean, I get lots of email, and I have 100 and some odd thousand in my inbox right now unread. I've come to the point where if the person writing me doesn't have a question mark, I don't need to answer. So that's my limit. If they're venting, and then if they come back and say, oh, I didn't see a question in there. So, I mean, I think that is the limit I've set. I'm looking for a question. But the key piece is really, and this is hard, can we be curious about, can we ask them a question? Not respond by an issue. Can we ask them a question about how they came to believe what they believe passionately, and begin to be curious about their position and how they had arrived that way, including their position. I mean, we have all kinds of things that really sound harsh in the context of Catholic social teaching. You know, around immigration, around climate change, around life issues, lots of things that sound harsh. Can we ask, you know, how did you come to believe this? Where this is key to rebuilding the dialogue, I think. So, Dan, I don't.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. I would say a question, how did you come to believe that? But ultimately, I think it's also a question of fundamental values and paradigms. What is your fundamental way of seeing the world? This is a slide that I use with my students from a book by the theologian Richard Gula, but I think this is such an important way to frame the conversation. So Gula would use the term intersectionality, as it predates his writing, but he describes that intense competition exists between the Christian community and many others which vie for our attention. Each of these communities competes for our loyalty, but often with contradictory beliefs, images, and norms. And so we're all intersectional in the sense that we identify as Catholic, as from a different state, as from a political party. And so we tend to coexist without conflict. But the question then becomes, what happens when values collide? What happens when my party says something and my church says another? What Gula describes is the important question before us is how decisive our Christian believing and beliefs ought to be for shaping our moral awareness. He references the Protestant theologian James Gustafson. As Gustafson would have it, they, meaning Christian identity, ought to be the most decisive, most informing, most influencing beliefs and experiences in the lives of people. So in addition to asking the question of how did you come to your belief, which I think is such an important question, I would say a related question is, if you take time to honestly reflect, what is your core identity? What are your fundamental values? What is your paradigm? When push comes to shove, are you more guided by the faith and teaching of the church, or are you more guided by the platform of one party or another? So especially when we think about those different sources for moral discernment, kind of where does the accent lie, or what gets elevated and what gets discounted? Maybe I'd say.
Yeah, and maybe I would just add this. I had a very wise pastor, Monsignor Perrin Ave. He's now retired. He said this, that as a pastor, he found this to be the challenge. The challenge is that people tend to look at public policy issues through a political lens, whether it's a left lens or a right lens, a red lens or a blue lens. And I think what we're about is like, no, we're putting on a pair of glasses, the lens of the gospel and the lens of our Catholic social teaching. And we're looking at everything politically, socially, through the lens of the gospel and the lens of Catholic social teaching. These are intimately, they're one thing. Anyway, hope that helps.
Thank you. So we are basically out of time. There were a lot of questions in the chat. Obviously, this is a very important issue. If we didn't get to your questions, feel free to email us at info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. I'll put that in the chat right now. And we will send that over to Bishop Tyson or Dan Dileo, whoever the question is directed to, and hopefully we'll get back to you soon on that. Again, thank you all for being here. I want to give a special thank you to Bishop Tyson and Dr. Dan Dileo for sharing your wisdom and inspiration with us. And thank you all for being here. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.